Okay, I think let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Gulf Intelligence Daily Energy Markets webinar today on the 3rd of October 2023. I am Vandana Hari, founder and CEO of Vanda Insights, provider of global oil markets macro analysis, coming to you from Singapore today. Wow, what a day. There's so much happening. Certainly in the oil markets in terms of oil prices, back in a very volatile zone, but in the volatility in the opposite direction to what we've been seeing in recent weeks. And then, of course, a lot going on at this ADIPEC conference in Abu Dhabi as well. I'll do my best to try and get through as many of the relevant issues of today as I possibly can in this half an hour with my three guests. So warm welcome to Mark Oswald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services International. Paul Hickin, Editor-in-Chief, Petroleum Economist. And we are really privileged that Paul is actually joining us right from the ADIPEC venue today in Abu Dhabi. And wonderful, Paul, that you could join us. And Narendra Taneja, leading India energy expert. So I'll start with the obvious question, and I'll start with you, Mark, if that's all right. So what's happening with crude prices? Barely a week ago, Brent was bobbing around 97, and the $100 lobby was saying, here we go. Just a matter of hours or days that we hit the century mark, and here we are today. November Brent it's popped up just above $90 Brent crude futures, December contract as we speak now. But most of this morning in Asia, it's actually been below $90. So quite a swing, I would think. Mark, do you think what we're seeing is just a bumpy recalibration in prices, a case of overshooting in one direction and then overshooting in the other, but then coming back to somewhere where the bulls are happy again? Or do you think it's a case of goodbye to the 90s and hello 80s, dollars per barrel, of course, for Brent?
I mean, I think the supply issue, which has come back quite vigorously over the last month, is still definitely there as a factor. The only problem was that we got to a stage where basically everyone was so bullish, everyone was long, that it was only going to take one little upset particularly from manufacturing data. And obviously the manufacturing PMIs yesterday were in general weak, even if in quite a few cases they improved somewhat. But it is that case that were basically, the market is very skewed. The market positioning was inordinately skewed. And I think all this is a classic correction. The extent of the move really highlights, I think, the underlying liquidity conditions, and this applies as much to bond markets and equity markets and indeed foreign exchange, is poor. And that's all down basically to central banks withdrawing liquidity, and we're in a much more significant downturn in terms of the quantitative tightening than we have been for quite some time. The last 3 months we've withdrawn something like 8% of the excess liquidity that's there, and that basically means we get into choppier, more volatile markets. And it is a case at the moment, I think, that basically it's everyone on the bus or everyone off the bus. So it's going to be quite a rocky ride. I still suspect we're going to have another look at 100 at some stage, simply because the supply backdrop, long-term supply backdrop, is not good, and there's no sign as yet that Saudi and Russia are about to relent on those production cuts.
Indeed. Would you say another look at $100 in the next few weeks before the end of this year, or are you thinking
before the end of the year? Okay.
you mentioned softness in the manufacturing PMIs, and a lot of the headwind story for the oil complex hasn't really changed, has it? I mean, PMIs have been very soft in the US, worse in Eurozone. China sort of flitting around 50 mark, not quite getting into expansion territory either. The fears over US possibly going into a recession, higher for longer interest rates. So my point is, none of the headwinds or the bearish case for oil has really changed. So do you see this as and there is the supply concerns on the other side, as you mentioned, but do you see the tables being turned? Do you think oil is reconnecting with the economic sentiment, the sour mood in the markets at all?
Well, if all the conferences I've been to recently and metals and energy and are anything to go by, I think basically it's symptomatic of the fact that most people really don't have any feel for what the demand picture looks like in the global economy. Pretty much every poll that I've seen at 5 conferences in the last 5 weeks basically says, are you bullish, bearish, or neutral? And most people were neutral because they just don't have a real feel for it. We've basically got in the background 2 conflicting forces. Underlying, there is an underlying downward pressure on economies simply from interest rates. There's no doubt about that. And from the weakness of the Chinese recovery and the weakness in Europe, particularly Germany. On the other hand, we do have this whole renewables push in the background. You've got US manufacturing construction up 69% as we had in the construction spending year on year yesterday. So there is that push, which is underpinning a lot of manufacturing activity. But overall, consumers are still very much feeling the pinch from from inflation. And in a lot of countries, basically, some of the budget generosity that's been there over the COVID period is being withdrawn, in some cases quite forcibly, like the UK and Germany, for example.
Yeah, so indeed, as you point out, the economic sentiment is a rather poor proxy for demand. And I think a lot of us, while supply, everyone is actually down to counting the barrels that are being put or removed from the market. Demand is quite fuzzy. Paul, I'd appreciate your thoughts on the same question. Has anything changed fundamentally in the market, do you think, to justify this $8 drop that we have seen over in less than a week?
I think it's the case of this battle between the macro and the micro. You've seen whichever the market seems to focus on seems to get the attention, and we are in this realistically a sort of $90 to $95 range at the moment. I think it's going to be a grind higher, but every time we talk about the grind higher, China economic weakness comes back into the fore, or US interest rates are going to stay higher for longer, comes back into the fore, and it reins things back in. But ultimately, supply is coming out the market. We've seen US commercial stocks and SPRs at as a combination, their lowest since 1985. And I think it's part of this comes into what's been priced in the market. The market goes through this procedure where it prices in all this sort of low stocks, this kind of weakness in China, and then it recalibrates again, and it's starting to price in. Actually, have we got too ahead of ourselves in this $100 oil? But I think to Mark's point, I think it is going to be a slow grind higher, and we are going to probably look at $100 oil again. All the fundamentals are there, unless we see a real backward turn in sort of inflation and China data, then the chances are it's going to be a tentative improvements, even though there is uncertainty. And I don't think that OPEC is going to change its tack anytime soon. I think we talk about surprises and when the next surprise is going to come from OPEC. I think the surprise may well come from OPEC continuing its lollipop, continuing its further cuts and baking them in further, not where some of the analysts are talking about in terms of taking its foot off that pedal. So I think there's that to consider as well.
Yeah, and I will come back to you for some more insights, specifically from ADIPEC. But just very quickly, from your first day's experience at the conference, is oil prices in much of a discussion point, or is it far more about energy transition?
Well, that's a big question, but I think it's interesting to see the IOCs all talking at panels about only want to talk about energy transition. All the optics are on renewables, but at the same time, you've got the OPEC Secretary General, you've got the UAE Energy Minister Mazrui, all talking about the importance of an oil investment and how we get how we need higher prices to get oil investment. So there is kind of an interesting contrast going at the event, and getting those two in sync is a big factor, I think, and it'll be interesting to see what else is said at the conference on that regard.
Yeah, also one is a much short-term sort of phenomenon and question, right? Like, where are oil prices going in the next 3 months, 6 months? And the other is an evolution that is going to span over the next few decades. So indeed, must be quite challenging to be riding those two horses. I'll come back to you a little bit more later for views from ADIPEC. But staying on the theme of energy transition, Narendra, India, as the G20 president this year, has assumed leadership of quite a few weighty global issues, and amongst them, clearly energy transition as well. As we approach COP28, how do you see India honing its message on this tension between energy transition and energy security, and specifically in relation to the need for continued investment in fossil fuels?
Well, good question, Vandana. You see, I mean, our focus is, our message is rather clear, that energy transition, there is no global bullet that you can, for instance, tell the whole world, look, this is how it looks, this is the color of it, and you got to accept it or you reject it. So there is no such thing. For instance, at the summit just a few weeks ago, majority of countries from the West, they wanted, a kind to put oil, gas, and coal on the radar, and to convey a message that we got to get rid of these fuels. And India and Saudi Arabia in particular, they joined forces and they said, no way. And that didn't happen. So oil and gas practically, do not figure in the New Delhi Declaration. So that was, in a way, you can call it a victory, or you call it basically saying that the power of these countries, made a difference. But that said, at the same time, India is a very densely populated country, and we are preparing for the future. We want to be a developed economy by 2047. And we know that we have to go for energy transition in a scientific manner. You see, energy transition has got two agendas. One is political, which is basically anchored by the West. They want to use energy transition and climate debate to hold on to kind of, their supremacy on multinational institutions, on the global narrative, and so on and so forth. The other is basically scientific. Scientific means, look, climate warming, call it climate boiling, is a reality, and we got to deal with it. And so therefore, energy transition, we have no option but to go in that direction. Like in India, with Indian characteristics, in America with American characteristics, in Australia with Australian characteristics. So that's basically what India is working on. We can see very clearly the Western countries using energy transition as a kind of political weapon to continue to hold on to the kind of status they have enjoyed. That's why they want status quo in terms of the global order. We can see through it, and we are challenging it. There's a pushback from India, Saudi Arabia, even China, Russia, many other countries. But at the same time, we accept and we realize energy transition, we have no option but to go for it. So we are very aggressively going for it, whether in BRICS or in SCO or G20, or we just as a nation. But at the same time, Vandana, we can very clearly see, for instance, when we talk of like the oil price we were talking, we can very clearly see. I find it very difficult to look at oil prices only in terms of demand and supply. Yes, that's the case. We know the economics play a very important role, but we also know that Saudi Arabia, which is a friend, very close friend of India, now is strategic, actually a partner of India. that they want money for whatever reasons. They want to transform their economy. They're preparing for post-oil economy, and they want oil minimum at $90 per barrel for next 2 years. And Russia has its own compulsions. More Iranian oil is, now in the global supply. Venezuelan oil is started flowing down to the global supply, and so on and so forth. We can see through it. But at the same time, point is that should we be subsidizing, let's say, the big dreams of country X or country Y, or the state of country A and country, and why should we do that? So that is a question. So, and BRICS is a very good platform for that. But this is the last line, Vandana. On this, the point is that there is a very strong political, call it geopolitical element in the oil prices. When we look at oil prices only in terms of through the computer screen, demand and supply, nothing else, we always reach to the wrong conclusion.
So I will pick you up again on India's pain point when it comes to oil prices, but just staying on the theme of transition very quickly, where does India stand on coal? Coal use has been growing in the country as well, as it has across Asia. Where does it stand on coal use?
Well, our dilemma is that 67% of electricity that we produce and consume in India, we are the third largest producer of electricity in the world, comes from coal. And it's just not possible for us to switch over overnight, because coal is the only, a source of energy which basically provides us energy security. Oil, 88% we are importing, gas, 56% we are importing, uranium, large chunk of uranium we are importing, solar also 90% equipment we are importing. So we are very vulnerable in terms of energy security. So only coal provides us that security. And so therefore, we will continue to use oil, gas, coal, unfortunately, for very, very long time to come. We are building new power plants also, and our dependence on coal is not going to come down anytime soon. But what we are doing in the meantime is, to decarbonize our coal, the entire coal infrastructure to the extent possible and as speedily as possible. And at the same time, bringing in more natural gas in place of coal wherever possible. But that said, at the same time, we still have 700 million people, Indian, living below energy poverty line. So we have to keep on the one hand to eradicate energy poverty. That agenda on the mind, politically for a democracy, very important. At the same time, to go for energy transition as aggressively as possible. Unfortunately, in terms of energy security, we don't have too many of it. When you look at the large economy of the world, we are the most vulnerable economy on the planet in terms of energy security, and we have to be extremely sensitive to it.
Indeed, and I think that message is coming through quite loud and clear from the country. Mark, coming back to you on sort of factors, the main factors that we see on the horizon over the next 3 months. Of course, people like to talk about the remaining quarter of the year, but even if you were to look out into 2024, do you see, so you mentioned that supply, the fundamentals on the supply side are not about to change. I think there's probably no disagreement there in terms of OPEC plus keeping a tight rein. But some of the other sort of issues that could weigh on crude. One is, of course, worsening environment in terms of consumer confidence or continuing contraction in manufacturing, fears of recession, US dollar, which has been gaining strength quite a bit in recent weeks, but hasn't really been not had a negative correlation with crude prices. Are there any headwinds that you can see at all if you look out into the next 3 months or 6 months?
Well, the US managed to sort out its immediate government shutdown risk, but it's only for 45 days.
45 days, exactly.
The biggest threat is that the US, the relative strength of the US relative to China and above all Europe doesn't hold up. There are a number of factors there. There's not only the ongoing threat of a government shutdown in another 45 days, because the Republicans clearly can't agree on anything. Whether this cross-house, this bipartisan unity that we saw on Saturday is something which we can expect more of in the future. I think it's not something I would gamble on. I would assume that there is a risk of further turmoil around McCarthy. And then you've got the student loan repayments starting as of this month. And you've got
another two Fed meetings as well. Another two Fed meetings and a possible
another Fed meetings. I think the Fed interest rate threat is not as much. I would be less worried about the Fed interest rate than I would be about the ongoing reduction in size of central bank balance sheets. We're now in a stage where we've drawn down more than 10% of what was added in terms of quantitative easing, and central bank balance sheets shrinking basically withdraws liquidity from the market, takes away, above all, that pressure on people. There's so much money floating around. We've got to put it to work. And above all, in an interest rate, high interest rate environment, basically, it's so easy for a lot of investors faced with all the uncertainty that we have, even if we're not talking about a doom and gloom scenario, but just uncertainty. It's very easy for investors to say, well, I can get 5% on a US T-bill for 3 months. I'll come and address this issue of what the actual outlook for the global economy is, because I can sit on this and generate 5%. I'm more than very, very happy. So I think the biggest threat comes from the US. Europe is definitely heading into a recession in the second half of the year. I have no doubts about it. I do have some questions about how weak China's economy is. I suspect it's actually troughing, and we'll see from the anecdotal evidence from the Autumn Festival National Day holidays this week whether there is a bit of pent-up demand coming from the accumulation of consumer savings, because the savings have built up quite substantially in China, and we haven't really had that pent-up demand post-zero COVID blow off yet. And it's there, and I would rather focus on that at the moment than the perennial problems of the property market, which aren't going to go away in any great hurry, but remain a very real threat. Anything which solved that, which I don't see as likely, but it's always a possibility, would obviously unleash an enormous amount of pent-up demand. And so I'd say the risks actually, to some extent, are quite balanced, because there's the negatives on the US, which is a positive at the moment, and there are the positives for China above all, rather than Europe, on the other side.
Yeah, then that probably makes the case for, or an argument against prices going too much on the upswing, like 100 and above, or and against them going too much on the downswing as well, right?
Yes.
As you said, it's quite balanced.
But also likely to generate a very choppy trading environment. So sort of $5-7 moves within a few days should be something we should just expect as the norm.
Yeah, it does indeed look that way. Paul, going back to ADIPEC, the UAE energy minister put out some stark numbers yesterday. He said that OPEC had lost something like 4 million barrels per day of production capacity over the past 3 years. He made quite an impassioned argument for more investment in fossil fuels. But look, he was probably speaking to like-minded professionals within ADIPEC. But if one were to look out at COP28 that UAE will host, and I'm sure it'll get a lot of pushback and views that are not quite aligned with those of the Middle Eastern oil and gas producers, how do you sense the mood there in terms of being able to bring these two divergent streams together in less than 2 months, especially arguing in favor of continuing to invest in oil and gas, and those saying that no, we should absolutely stop it?
I think it's the messages from OPEC is getting louder and louder. It's the same message, but it's getting louder. We need to invest in oil, otherwise we're going to have a chaos in transition. It's not going to be orderly, and I think that's been a strong message. I think they've become more confident about their messaging about oil investment, the need for more oil investment. I think they're trying to reach out to say, look, this is where Masri and the Secretary General both mentioned about the short-sightedness of looking at prices right now. from a consumer angle, because it's not just consumers it's basically needing IOC investment. And what price does IOC start investing in some of these OPEC countries, getting more investment into oil? What price is needed? And clearly OPEC think $90, $100 barrel for a consistent period of time is going to be needed. It's going to become the new normal in terms of getting investment into oil to help provide some kind of stability until the transition is scalable in a way that's, because everyone can talk all they want and the messaging about transition, but until it's scalable, until the technology is there to really roll it out, I mean, oil is going to be a crucial part of the energy mix. And I think it's interesting when you mentioned coal earlier. Coal takes up it's the biggest proportion of power generation across the world, and not oil. Oil's a slither of that. So OPEC will probably look over there. It's look at the coal, not oil, because if we're going to talk about transition. So I think in that sense, oil is crucial to the mix. It's still crucial to any transition right now. And I think OPEC's messaging is not going away on that. And like I said, $90 to $100 has probably become the new normal for getting for OPEC and for the oil market to get some investment, and consumers may have to lump it. And just to add to Mark's point about what risks and what you mentioned about what risks are to next year's oil prices, and I don't want to sound trite about it, but high oil prices are the big risk for next year. We could be in a situation where there's a slow grind higher, and it's a kind of a parable of the boiled frog. How high do oil prices go until demand destruction kicks in? We've seen from analysts, from JP Morgan and others talking about, well, actually demand destruction is maybe not quite there in the same way because prices are going up slowly. But I think at some point, demand destruction really does kick in. Prices will get felt no matter how slowly the prices rise. And that's the danger for next year, I think.
Yeah. So at what point do consumers start feeling the pain and we actually get that thing called demand response? Remember, almost nobody talks about it anymore. And that would be a perfect segue for my next question for Narendra. But before I go to him, let's have the survey question. So as Paul mentioned as well, that the thought process in the Middle East is that perhaps 90 to 100 is what is needed for continued investment in oil. So here's our question today. Can we expect more supply tightening from Saudi Arabia, in addition to what it is already doing, if crude retreats into the 80s? So perhaps not just where it is hovering now, but let's imagine it starts going back towards $85 or $80. Please go ahead and have your say. Do we think Saudi Arabia will curtail even more production? Because as we know, they can do so. They've said they keep all options open, and usually the market thinks about, okay, when will they taper? But equally, they could tighten some more as well. Which brings me to the final thoughts. Narendra, a question, and again, as Paul was saying and Mark was saying as well, at what stage do consumers start pulling the purse strings tighter? So a question that often pops up, especially when crude rallies towards $100, is where is the demand response? Especially from Asia, countries like India. So the past few months, we've seen really not much of a response, at least measured in terms of the retail fuel sales, or how much the countries are importing, whether it's China or India or Asia as a whole. So in the case of India, what do you think is happening? Is it the 40% of crude that India is getting on a discounted basis from Russia? Is that sort of, providing a cushion? Or is it simply that the population has just become inured to high inflation? Or is it that demand response is well and alive, but it just takes time?
Well, you see, Vandana, we are an oil economy. Oil actually is more central to India's economy than probably of any other economy that I can think of course, referring to large economies, and therefore is a highly political commodity in India. So yes, discounted oil from Russia has been a major help. Let me put it this way, in the sense that keeping oil prices, within the limits, and the government also, though oil and petrol, diesel are decontrolled commodities, but there is a kind of control decontrol in the sense that government keeps an eye on it very, very closely. So these companies are kind of, if you go strictly by law, they can actually increase the price any hour they want, but they are not doing that because majority of these companies are state-owned. So that's what I said. It's a controlled decontrolled. It's a controlled, deregulation. And I can understand, given the kind of, the role that oil plays in India's economy, and the economy of very ordinary Indian and of course industrial houses. But my sense is that, as long as oil is, let's say, $80 per barrel, or in that region, I think Indian economy can deal with it. Indian consumer can deal with it. Indian, manufacturers can deal with it. But if anything more than $80, then it becomes a hot potato. Then I think, you will see New Delhi calling Riyadh, talking with the crown prince there, or exchanging notes with President Biden, or talking more with Moscow. We can buy more oil at a discount rate and so on and so forth. So I think it is $80 per barrel is a kind of, the red line. In India, we call it Lakshman Rekha. So anything below that is great, but anything more than that, India is going to basically use whatever platform available. And right now we have got BRICS available now. The two large importers and two large producers are a part of the BRICS group. So we can always convert BRICS into kind of platform where the consumers and producers, they both come together or just pick up the phone and talk. So I think that might have already happened. And my sense is that, when prices are going beyond 90, I'm sure that New Delhi and Riyadh, they have been talking. And probably with Washington, D.C. in the loop somewhere. And because if oil prices go beyond $90 per barrel over the next 7-8 months, and we are heading for elections in May, I think that will not really go well for the ruling party in India. And the same might happen with President Biden in the United States. So I think it's a politically very sensitive commodity. And our own numbers are that in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, and in Kuwait, in these countries, we very closely monitor the cost of production of oil. Cost of production of oil in Saudi Arabia is not as high as in Krishna Godavari in the Bay of Bengal for India, or in GC, or in the Gulf of Mexico, or in the Arctic. We know that. So therefore, their argument that we need more money so that we can invest more for global energy security, we find it difficult to buy. So therefore, the point here is that as long as it is in the region of $80 per barrel, we can deal with it. India can handle it, and it will work fine for Indian economy. But anything more than that, then India will have to talk, more with Moscow and see what more can be done, and at the same time talk with our friends in Riyadh. Now that we are also building India Middle East Economic Corridor, that that you need to take care of that. We understand your need for more money, but understand unless we also continue to grow smoothly and continue to demand more oil, actually it's not good for you. So it's kind of those dialogues are already happening.
Seems like behind the scenes diplomacy, which probably doesn't make it to the media, or it's certainly not the international media, but is very much on. And let's see what the room said in terms of where Saudi Arabia would want prices to be. Okay, so Saudi Arabia could tighten more to try and keep prices in the 90 to 100 range. Interesting response. And of course, we'll see what the Twitterati say as well later. I keep forgetting it's changed its name, but never mind. Okay, with that, I think we've had a wonderful discussion. I've certainly learned a lot today. Thank you very much to my three guests, Mark Oswald, Paul Hicken, and Narendra Taneja. Thank you very much. Have a great day and week ahead, everyone. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you, Vandana. Thank you.
Bye-bye.